The opposition parties have come out swinging against the government's new national security plan, but for different reasons, as you can imagine. The Conservatives accuse the Liberals of compromising Canadian safety. The NDP says the government has reneged on its promise to get rid of what it sees as the worst parts of the existing anti-terror laws. Of course, the Liberals standing by the bill, saying it strikes the right balance and protects Canadians' charter rights. So what changes, if any, would the opposition like to see in Canada's new anti-terror plan? Joining me from the foyer of the House of Commons, Ontario Conservative MP Aaron O'Toole, NDP public safety critic Matthew Dubé. Good to see you both, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
Aaron O'Toole, I'll start with you. You said that this is a dangerous step back and makes it clear Liberals don't take public safety seriously. What specifically are you talking about there?
Well, I'm talking about some of the powers for law enforcement to detain public safety risks. What's interesting, Rosie, and the Liberals are trying to play all sides on this, Justin Trudeau voted in favor of C-59 and actually praised the preventative arrest measures that allowed the law enforcement, they needed an evidentiary burden, but it was lower if there was a risk of someone committing an attack, likely to commit an attack before they could detain or put a peace bond in effect. Now they've changed that standard to make it very hard for law enforcement to detain someone they feel is a risk. They've changed it to a standard that's necessary to prevent a terrorist attack. We think that's too high. They've also changed the burden for someone that has been publicly promoting a terrorist attack into someone who is counseling others, someone to commit an attack. We think the burdens are going to be too high. Law enforcement is going to be held back from keeping Canadians safe. Okay,
well, 2 points on that. The government would say to you, Mr. O'Toole, that preventative detention has never been used, and so they don't feel, they removed it, and they don't feel that making the threshold higher is a problem because it's not a tool that law enforcement seems to need anyway.
Well, look, they could have used it in the Aaron Driver case, Rosie. That was a case where a young Canadian who'd been radicalized was on his way to blow something up when he was caught.
But he was on a peace bond, Mr. O'Toole.
Under the old system, before C-51.
Well, he was on a criminal peace bond, not the other measure that would have been used under C-51.
The measures that would have allowed, had law enforcement been peaked to him a little bit earlier, he would have been able to be detained. Now, under the changes in C-59, they would not be able to act. The situation with Patrice Vincent in Quebec, they would not be able to detain that person either because they're rolling back the standard and erring against public safety.
Yeah, but they weren't. But my point is they weren't using that measure anyway. So who cares if they're rolling it back, given that police had never tapped it?
Well, listen. That's good, Rosie. We don't have risks every day in Canada. But what we have to do is have a system so that when there is a risk, law enforcement can lean in favor of public safety, detain someone. It's court moderated. These were charter compliant issues. The case is we want law enforcement to be able to eliminate the risk immediately rather than taking months to build a case, because with the radicalized threats we've seen in the past, and they've seen in Europe in the last few weeks, things can change on a dime. We can't allow the burden to be so high that we're putting people at risk.
Okay, Matthew Dubé, I'm guessing you have a different take, that your leader said that things didn't go far enough to roll back some of the Conservative measures. What specifically is problematic here for you?
Sure, well, there's a few things. I just want to say off the bat that there are things that we like. We certainly like seeing the creation of what's called the Super Circ, this larger review body. That's certainly long overdue. As to what we'd like a little less, and has disappointed us, as you mentioned, is among other things, starting with the information sharing piece that was one of the most controversial elements of C-51. That has been changed to disclosure, but whether you call it disclosure or sharing, the regime that's been put in place is still the same. That's something the Privacy Commissioner raised concerns about, and it hasn't really changed under this legislation. The other piece is obviously with regards to metadata, which actually wasn't something that's was in C-51. But what we see reading this bill is we've actually legalized what was illegal. What the federal court ruled a few months ago was illegal with regards to CSIS's bulk collecting of metadata, the collecting of bulk metadata. And so what we're seeing here is we're going in a direction where technology is evolving quickly and Canadians are more and more concerned about their privacy. But between the information sharing regime and this codifying of CSIS's collection of metadata, it certainly cause for concern in that sense. And finally, one last point.
Yes.
CSIS still has the threat reduction powers that we believe go fly in the face of the reason why they exist in the first place. CSIS this was created to separate law enforcement from intelligence gathering after many controversies involving the RCMP. Right. And despite changes to the criteria to use those powers, we don't think they have any business being there in the first place.
Okay, well let's put that point to Aaron O'Toole, because they've changed those powers to disrupt, as they were commonly known, quite substantially, putting a number of limitations on them that your government had put in place that, for instance, would have allowed CSIS to harm someone physically, go after them, torture them. All those things have now been separated. And now there are measures that they are required to follow in order to go after people, things like interfering with the movement of person, disrupting a financial transaction. There are limitations around the power to disrupt. Do you think that is good? Because lots of people thought that what your government put in place was much too far.
Well, to use the example you used on me earlier, Rosie, none of those provisions, the charter violation, disrupt in effect, had been used. And in fact, there was an conflation of that element of the disruption powers. When the old CSIS chair appeared before committee, he said those powers had been used about 24 times. And never had a charter violation been part of the disruption powers.
Still, isn't it a good thing for a government to write down what you're not allowed to do, rather than just allow the door to be wide open for CSIS to do whatever they want?
Well, listen, a wiretap violates a charter, right? You know, these sort of investigative techniques have evolved over our society and the threat. Always there needs to be court supervision. Mm-hmm. There was with C-51. So there was a lot of the sky is falling about this debate in the last parliament. The Liberals tried to have both sides of the issue. They tried to squeeze the NDP by criticizing C-51, but then they voted for it. Today we see a presentation, as Matthew said, I agree with some of the Super Circ and some of the other provisions in this omnibus bill, but there are some elements that actually set law enforcement back, and that's what we have issues with.
Okay, so the minister made it very clear he's open to listening. He's got 150 pages here. This is just the beginning of this conversation. Mr. O'Toole, the most important thing that you would like to see changed, or at least debated a little further?
Well, just like last summer, they put these important security bills right into the House, you know, one day before we leave, because they want a real robust collaboration on them. I would like to see these provisions rolled back to the standard they were before, so that we make sure that an evidentiary burden is needed before someone's detained or before a charge is laid. But we should always be making sure that law enforcement have the tools needed to keep us safe. And that's what I'd like to see.
They're not going to do that, though. I mean, those are the exact parts that they were elected on rolling back. So is there anything there that would be somewhere middle of the ground that you think you actually might be able to influence? Because those things aren't going to happen.
Well, that's not correct, Rosie. They weren't re-elected for those provisions. In fact, Mr. Trudeau's speech in the House on C-51, he praised preventative arrest, and he talked about the need for oversight. So the Committee of Parliamentarians, all that stuff were in favor.
They were elected on rolling back things in C-51 that may have violated the Canadian Charter. They've determined that these things have.
Well, those provisions, specifically law enforcement, the legal burden, did not violate the Charter.
Okay, Matthew Dubé, is there one thing in there that if the minister is taking ideas that you would absolutely want to see him change?
Well, obviously, our wish is to still see the full repeal, but in knowing that this is where the Liberals are going, certainly we're going to take the time to study the bill. It is 150 pages long. It's a lot of big changes and complicated issues. So we're going to take the time to look at how we can further restrict this information sharing regime. That's certainly something that causes concern for us. And also when it comes to metadata, we don't believe that there's enough clarity in the bill, and that's something that causes concern for us when it comes to protecting Canadians' privacy.
Okay, it's going to take a while. So thanks for your first thoughts, and we'll talk about it more in the months ahead. Thank you both, gentlemen. Aaron O'Toole, Matthew Dubé, thank you.
Thank you.